Welcome to the She, He, We Awakening podcast. We are a wife and husband therapy team whose professional and personal lives are centered on psychology and spirituality.
We love sharing what we've learned on our journey of becoming conscious through relationship, and we invite you to get to know us and hopefully hear in our stories something that can support you in your life too.
Hello, my love. We meet again.
Yes, we are here again.
So nice to see you again.
Mm-hmm.
After the multiple hours away
Yeah,
earlier today, the eternity of 2 hours.
So we're going to talk today about suffering and the nature of suffering and how to be with suffering and use it as medicine.
Yes. And I think that it might be appropriate to lead with a caveat, given that at the time of this recording, it's like 24 hours after yet another mass shooting at an elementary school. This one in Texas. And so there's going to be a lot of people suffering, obviously immediate family and friends. And for me, the caveat here is that technically in our discussion of suffering, there is something there for those people, but this is probably not the time, right? That this conversation is not really meant to be addressed to those people in the acute stages of suffering after a tragedy like this, for reasons that maybe we'll get into during the conversation, maybe not, but given that we'll be releasing this, within the next day or two, so still, while this is very fresh on people's minds, just know that there's a difference between teaching about the nature of suffering in a way that allows people to have the space to sort of dip their toes into that as appropriate, versus flinging that in somebody's face who is acutely suffering. And so that's not really our intention with this. But for those who are listening, who aren't immediately impacted by that event or by any other particular event at the moment, the things we are saying do apply. And so there's an invitation for people who are in a stable place emotionally and psychologically to feel into that.
Right. So nothing that we say today is meant to be explored when you are in a strong emotional experience. It's thoughts on suffering are best, or exploration of the concept of suffering is best done, like you said, when you're actually more stable, you're more present, you're more relaxed, and you can begin to work with the concept gently.
Right.
You wouldn't do it immediately after a death necessarily, or
Right.
a
Yep.
world crisis of some kind.
Yes.
Otherwise, you are going to be prone to bypassing.
Right.
Mhm.
And yes, to that point, maybe a more concise way of putting this is that to teach these sorts of things to somebody in an acute state of suffering is to suggest that there's a problem with their suffering, and that they should somehow know better or do better, and that's not true. In the acute stages of suffering, there's really nothing to do other than suffer.
Mhm.
And support oneself and allow oneself to be supported to the best of our ability.
Yeah. Comfort
So,
seeking.
yeah, it's not the time for lessons. So, having said all of that, where do we want to begin today with this topic and question of suffering?
Well, I think we wanted to begin by talking about the non-dual understanding of suffering that has been the gifts of Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
And the Buddhism has these four noble truths that are teachings on suffering. The first one says that life is suffering. They call it dukkha, D-U-K-K-A. And that this dukkha is the innate characteristic of existence in the realm of illusion, which means that in our bodies, in our minds, when we're identified in that place with body and mind and ego, that part of that experience of being human is that we will experience suffering.
Right. So to connect this back to a previous podcast, our episode on the pre-trans fallacy, which if you haven't listened to that, it might be helpful to listen to that prior to this particular podcast. Or if not, go back after. It'll be helpful. So very briefly, the pre-trans fallacy says that there are concepts like suffering, for example, where the transcendent understanding of suffering can be and often is conflated with or confused for a pre-developmental relationship to that same concept. And that in between those two is some middle expression of the concept that looks like the opposite. So that was potentially very confusing. So let's revisit that a couple ways. There are three ways to be with a concept. Let's call it suffering, today's topic. There's A, B, and C. A is a pre-developed way of being with the concept. C is a transcendent or trans way of being with the concept. And in the middle is B. A and C are going to, on the surface, look very similar, if not identical. And B, in the middle of those two, is going to look like it directly contradicts A and C. Okay. So with suffering, and we see this all the time with people, both in the emotional work that we do with people, and I see it a lot with people coming in for physical symptoms. People come in and say, or either they directly say or they imply with their language or their energy that they perceive themselves to be experiencing a degree of suffering that is somehow indicative of a problem or some misalignment to reality. Something is fundamentally wrong and it should not be that way and does not have to be that way. And nothing will make me happy until this suffering is gone. And so their statement is one of, I shouldn't have to suffer. And technically, that is the C place, the transcendent relationship to suffering, which is the second noble truth in Buddhism, right? So let's share them both. So the first one is life is suffering.
Yeah.
And the second one is?
The origin of suffering is craving, longing, desire. Those are kind of synonymous.
Right.
Or attachment and avoidance.
Okay.
So it's desiring something and pushing something away.
Right. And so then it's actually the third one. So then going beyond that, the third noble truth is
suffering can end.
Suffering can end, which would seem to contradict point one, which is that life is suffering. Right. So in this example, people who come in with this sense of I shouldn't have to suffer, it looks like they're saying and tapping into that third noble truth, which is that suffering can end. And technically that's true, but that's the transcendent experience of suffering. And before we can get to that transcendent understanding of suffering, or the third noble truth, there's a reason that they're in this order. We have to move completely into and fully embrace the first noble truth, which is that life is suffering. And so on this A, B, C trending of our relationship to suffering within the pre-trans fallacy, A is where we see most people who are saying, I don't want to suffer and I shouldn't have to suffer. And that looks and sounds like C, suffering can end, except they're in the pre-developmental relationship to suffering. And before they can get from A to C, they have to go through B.
Mm-hmm.
And B is the first noble truth. Life is suffering. That's the realm of ego and duality. And we can't avoid that and can't get around that. We have to move through that.
Right. So Buddhists will begin with just pure acceptance or working into acceptance that suffering exists. And the reason that suffering exists from a non-dual perspective is that we are always wanting something or not wanting something. So in the example of the person in pain, there's avoidance and denial and wanting to push away the experience of pain, whether it's physical or emotional. Mm-hmm. However, we cannot really release ourselves from the first noble truth of life is suffering until we also accept that we are creating the suffering that we're experiencing through our perspective.
Right.
So seeing, and just so everybody is clear right now, it's very difficult to not see things that are painful in the world and think, oh, that's good. Like, that's a good thing that's happening. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to cope with these things, violence, turmoil in the world or in our own lives, our personal lives. So, the lesson is not to talk yourself out of the feelings. That's if you talk yourself out of your feelings, you're just delaying your suffering. You're just putting it off for another day.
Right. Trying to get from A to C without going through B.
Right.
Which we can't do. Yes. And so you said, and this is the part of the second noble truth, which is that essentially suffering is a perspective. Mm-hmm. Right. And you talked about shifting our perspective. And more technically speaking, what we would say is that suffering is the result of the ego perspective. Mm-hmm. Always. The ego being the sense of I, which is really the small self, which thinks it's the big self because it doesn't know any better. And it's the inevitable result of the perspective of that small egoic self, which through its very function sees separation, sees contrast, sees comparison, is a function of judgment, and not even in a pejorative sense. That's just what it does. That's its job, to judge good or bad, right or wrong, yes or no, up or down. Mm-hmm. And that's what allows us to navigate through the world, is a well-developed and strong, healthy ego function. And so the ego does have to be there. Again, we've done a previous podcast on understanding ego function. Would be helpful to listen to that. And so to say that the ego function has to be there for us to operate in the world is actually saying the same thing as that first noble truth, which is that life is suffering. You can't avoid suffering because you can't avoid functioning through the ego perspective in that sort of middle place, between A and C, which is
pre
the
and
realm
trans.
between pre and trans, the realm of duality, essentially. Mm-hmm. And so as long as we're in ego perspective, we will suffer. Mm-hmm. And so when we talk about the end of suffering being essentially a change in perspective, it's way more than just, oh, I'm going to wake up today with a better attitude. Right? It's not just the flipping of a light switch. It does take practice time, cultivation, until we have had the experience of a sense of I that is beyond ego.
Mm.
And until that really kind of integrates and sticks around, then the situation changes. But until that happens, and we're still functioning with a sense of I am one being and you are some separate being, that sense of separation and the ego function that creates it will always be accompanied with suffering. It's just the nature of reality.
Mhm. I'd like to talk a little bit about, or maybe build a little bit of a map based on my own personal experience
Right.
of how I saw myself evolve in this relationship with suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So, the first part of my life before I began therapy, my life was devoted to avoiding suffering at all costs, and also simultaneously creating suffering for myself by avoiding the suffering, and also through desiring things,
Mm-hmm.
and through the limited perspective that I had of my small self experiences. And so, a large part of my healing process in the beginning was to even begin to understand how I was thinking and feeling about myself and the world, because I hadn't even attempted to get in there deep and try to understand myself. What kinds of fears and beliefs do I actually have? Why am I triggered in these situations? So the first step was even to accept that I was suffering. I was suffering silently
Mm-hmm.
without awareness. So a lot of people in the world are suffering silently without awareness. They're triggered, they're reactive, but they don't know why. And, people who have therapy are like, why can't you see what's happening? It's so clear. But until you've done some therapy and some inner work, you just don't know. You just know you're upset. You have no idea why. Suffering exists, and you try your best to avoid it and minimize it. So after I began to understand, okay, I'm suffering because I have a fear that I'm not good enough. I'm suffering in my relationships because I'm taking care of other people instead of taking care of myself. I'm suffering with my kids because I'm always afraid that something bad's going to happen to them. Once I learned to identify the areas that I was suffering in, the perspectives that I had, then I could begin to shift those narratives. And by taking action in my life, showing up for myself in relationships, beginning to allay my own fears about what actually was going to happen to my kids, beginning to see the world as a mostly benevolent place. So that was the work of the middle place, of coming out of the ignorance of my own suffering, understanding that I was suffering and how I was suffering, and then beginning to shift those negative stories
Mm-hmm.
slowly, very slowly over time, until I had a more clear view of the world as containing equal light, equal dark, um, at people that were doing bad things, people that were doing good things. But the very first step for me was actually to see that people were doing bad things.
Right. Yes.
Because I had decided to deny that.
Sure. And I would imagine, much like myself in my process, it's seeing that and accepting that as a part of the nature of duality,
Mm-hmm.
of the manifest world, of the experience of creation from the perspective of the ego. That to lament the presence of, quote, evil from that perspective is to lament the fact that we manipulate ourselves through an imaginary field called space that has an up and a down and a left and right.
Mm.
And that when you understand the nature of the dual perspective, To lament the presence of evil in the world is the same thing as lamenting the presence of a z-axis. We don't get to just live in a two-dimensional x and y plane. We live in a three-dimensional space that has a z-axis, and the fact that up has an opposite called down is what allows us to exist in this space. And if there's an up and a down and a black and a white, then there is going to be a quote unquote good and evil. And that it's built into reality, and that, as you're expressing and as I also experienced, acceptance of that, i.e., life is suffering,
Mm-hmm.
i.e., there is evil in the world, accepting that and not expecting the world to be something that it isn't, is in fact the prerequisite for moving beyond suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you have to actually be willing to look at what's wrong, what's quote wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Like you have to be willing to engage with that story that there's something wrong here and there's something right here
Mm-hmm.
before you can get to this trans place of like, it is as it is.
Right.
So yeah, I think a lot of people struggle with that part of the work. They
Yes.
want to tell the stories that my childhood was fine, my job is fine, my marriage is fine. And so doing your shadow work is beginning to step into, actually, I don't really like the way things are, and I don't know why yet, but I'm willing to begin to look at them
Mm-hmm.
and engage with that process.
Yes. And we can also say, and this is me speaking from my direct experience, that this unwillingness to recognize the world as being both good and evil, and that the evil isn't some fundamental flaw to the world, but is in fact part of what allows the world to be the world. It's part of what allows for a three-dimensional space to exist that we can interact in from the ego perspective. That it's just built into that. But the rejection of that in the world is really a projection of our own rejection of that truth within ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Putting that much more bluntly, it's us not wanting to recognize that evil lives within us. And people don't want to admit that. They don't want to look at that. They don't want to confront that. And they want to often just pretend that if I just show up in the world and choose to do the right thing, or choose to be kind and choose to be good, which I'm all for, by the way, I'm not suggesting otherwise. Please be nice to each other. Please love one another. That just because we're doing that doesn't mean that the potential for evil doesn't live within us, that it does, just like it lives in the world. It can't not. And so it is absolutely essential, if we want to move into the understanding of that third noble truth, that suffering has an end, we must first move into an acceptance of the source of suffering,
Mm-hmm.
which is not something out in the world. It's something that lives within each of us, which is the reality of light and dark,
Mm-hmm.
good and evil.
Right. And it's just our human nature to desire what feels good to us and to want to push away what feels bad to us.
Right.
But that's a huge spectrum. Like what feels good to you doesn't feel good to me, and vice versa in some cases, right? So it's very even what feels good to us can be arbitrary.
Usually is, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I agree.
And the other thing to know about the second noble truth, which is, where does suffering come from?
Mm-hmm.
So there's the desire and the craving and the shoving away, attachment, non-attachment, that dynamic. But there's also ignorance, which means we can't see the world as it is. It's like walking around blindfolded. We're suffering because we're only willing to look at one aspect of reality. rather than the totality of reality.
Right.
And that takes a long time for people to have the ignorance removed.
And again, all of that is code for ego perspective. The ego perspective is the perspective of ignorance. It's the perspective that only sees separation, can only see separation because that's what it's designed to do. That is its function, is to take the one unified field of consciousness and seemingly separate it into a few billion people. And through that seeming separation, again, we now have what seems to be a three-dimensional world full of separate individuals relating to one another, having nice conversations, going down to a beach and then up to a mountain, having the whole color palette of human experience that can in fact only happen through that perspective of ignorance. The ignorance or the forgetting of the truth of unity. Right. And so that forgetting has its blessing and its curse, so to speak. The blessing is that I got to stumble into you in the world and go, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Let's spend our lives together. I like hanging out with you. The seeming experience of connecting with a separate other is the blessing of the ego. But then the curse is that we cannot have that experience without also being willing to accept the suffering side of that.
And sometimes I go away.
Sometimes you go away. And one day, one of us will seemingly go away from the other, quote, for good prior to the other one. And that there would be, from the ego perspective, there an invitation to suffer because of that, if you haven't been connected to the greater truth of that. So, as always, the purpose here is not to villainize the ego. And it's not to make the world bad. It's just to understand what that function is, how it works, and what the blessing side of it is, and what the quote downside of it is. But again, the idea here is that you can't have one side of a coin. If you want to experience all of the beauty of duality, of having loved ones, loving a seemingly separate other human being, that we must also be willing to experience the seeming loss of human beings or others, or a particular experience, or the loss of our, quote, innocence, or the loss of our youth, or literally any object in time and space that we have assigned value to, or to use a word from the second noble truth, that we've become attached to, right? That we can't experience the joy of that attachment without experiencing the suffering that comes from the inevitable loss of that object. And all objects are ultimately impermanent, and they will all be lost because ultimately they're not real. So another word I want to throw out is seeking. That's another word that helps to encapsulate that second noble truth, which is helping us to understand where suffering comes from. All suffering is associated with seeking. And when we perceive ourselves to have found the thing we have sought, we have this experience of the opposite of suffering, a sense of joy and peace. But inevitably, because that was never really about the object, we come back to a sense of suffering again because we start to seek again. because what we're really seeking is not a particular object and not a particular person, not a particular experience. We're seeking to know ourselves. Right. So that seeking is another way of understanding suffering.
Yes. So the Buddhists will say that anytime you want something, it's inevitable that you will want something else immediately. Once you've decided you've attained that thing, your desire will shift to a new thing. And so on and on and on you go through the cycles of life, wanting, craving, trying to push away the loss of that thing forever.
And then just replacing it with something new and going, oh, okay, well, that object didn't permanently satisfy my seeking. So I will transpose my seeking onto some other object. And we continue to do that. Sometimes the object is a person. Sometimes it's a particular kind of life experience. Sometimes it is even something grand and spiritually oriented, like my purpose in life, in all capitals, my life purpose, or even God. I'm seeking God. I'm seeking my life purpose. And the reason that we can never find those things in a way that permanently satisfies us is because those things don't exist as objects. And so even that first step of seeking is to actually step further away from the reality of those things, which is always within us. So if I forget that I'm here and I say, I need to find myself, and I take a step away from myself, so to speak, my first step of seeking is actually the beginning of my suffering. I've just moved away from myself without knowing it.
Well, here's a little bit more about that too. I think a lot of people in the pre-state, if you suggest to them that stepping towards something would be stepping away from themselves, they wouldn't be able to understand that because they don't know what this is.
Agreed.
I have no idea what this is.
Right.
So paradoxically, the act of going out there and seeking experience with things and interacting mindfully in the world with the desire to know the self, to know yourself, brings you closer to knowing yourself. I mean, that was definitely my experience. I needed to seek different teachers. I needed to seek different books. I needed to try a lot of different things until eventually I was satisfied that I had touched enough in reality to know who this is.
Yes. But to be clear, here's the part, and inevitably it happens where I speak for you, and but we have the same experiences, so I'm really speaking for me. That the thing that brought you peace or the end of suffering wasn't that you found those things. It's that you experimented with seeking enough to give up seeking. Right?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't know that when I was seeking, though.
Right. Of course.
I knew that at the end. I was like, oh, here I was all along.
Right.
That's okay.
And so, yes,
seeking was still fun.
Yeah, I agreed. And I'm glad you brought this back into sort of the practical application side, because these are very difficult and complex questions to discuss, which is why they've been, central philosophical and theological questions for thousands of years that many people have still not been satisfied with. And so we're trying to do it in, 80 minutes. So the higher truth is that it's the seeking that is the cause of suffering. It's because when we're seeking something, we're attached to something. And again, that's that second noble truth. It's really the attachment and the sense of separation and being apart from something. It's the illusion of the ego perspective is
Mhm.
really where all suffering comes from. And yet at the same time, as we talked about at the beginning, the answer to that isn't to avoid it. It's to move
Mhm.
through it and
Mhm.
engage with it and participate with it, participate in it, ideally with some sense of, um, I know I'm on a bit of a fool's errand here, but I also know that I have to do this. I have to play this game. I have to participate in duality. I have to not make the ego bad. I have
Mhm.
to not avoid loving another human being out of fear of losing that human being. That in fact, I have to dive into the suffering and accept that first noble truth. I have to be willing to seek before I can understand that what I'm really seeking is an end to seeking.
Right. It's
That's
the
the
hero's
paradox.
journey, right?
Yeah.
The hero's journey of being willing to at least to even go on the adventure,
Mhm.
have the adventure, and have the failures and the breakthroughs and the awareness that comes with all of the seeking.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like isn't the word disciple, like, it doesn't that have to do with following or like literally walking on a path?
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you mentioned the hero's journey. I'll use a topical pop culture reference. It's part of why I love the Star Wars saga,
Mhm.
um, because its development was done consciously with an understanding of these themes and archetypes. Um, and it is a hero's journey. And if you ask most people who the hero of Star Wars is, they would say Luke Skywalker. Except that's not actually true. That's not actually how the story is resolved. Luke Skywalker is the seeker, and he, as the seeker, does not bring about the resolution of the conflict in the story. Luke Skywalker does not bring about the end of suffering. He thinks that's his job and acts like that's his job. In other words, he participates voluntarily all the way through the story up until the very end when he says, I give up.
Mhm.
And he refuses to fight and he surrenders and he closes down his lightsaber and basically says, I would rather die than continue, follow this path to its inevitable conclusion, which is where I become a part of the problem. In other words, where I go to the dark side,
Mhm.
um, by killing, essentially.
Mhm.
And so he comes all the way up as close as he can get, and then ultimately surrenders. And it is the opposite. The agent of dark, it is his father, Darth Vader, who is actually the hero of the story. He's the one that brings about the end of suffering when, through Luke's act of surrender, something shifts within him and he sees now Luke suffering at the hands of the emperor, and something clicks and he says no, and he grabs the emperor and throws him down uh, the well. And um, and so that's how that story resolves. It isn't the seeker. Luke Skywalker is the seeker. He doesn't bring about the end of suffering. He gets as far as one can go by participating in the process, and then says, just like you did, "That's it. I've seen enough. This is everything I can possibly find through the path of seeking, and now I surrender."
Beautiful.
Yes.
And I think when you get to that place where you are just satisfied that you know yourself, that is when suffering, you cease to experience life as suffering. It's
Mhm.
not like you're unable to see the suffering of others. It doesn't make you a holier than thou person. Who It doesn't make you a magical thinker. It's just that there's a differentiation in your experience between I have pain,
Mm-hmm.
I'm experiencing pain or an emotional sensation, and I am suffering, which is, in my experience, for me, suffering is in my mind. Suffering is in the stories that I create in the moment about the pain.
Right. Another way of putting that would be to say suffering is about identification, because the identification is a story. The ego identification is a story.
Mm-hmm.
And so the experience of moving beyond suffering, as you're saying, is not one of never experiencing pain or never experiencing difficulty. It's that when we come to know who we are and no longer are ego identified, we know that we are not our experiences.
Mm-hmm.
We are not our emotions. We are not our sensations. We are not the sensations that are arising in the body any more than I'm this microphone or this desk. They're all just objects in duality in space-time, whether it's a desk or a mug or a sharp sensation arising in the body or a thought that arises in the mind. They're all just objects over there, and I am here. And all
Mm-hmm.
these things are just arising in my sort of field of awareness. And so the difference isn't that the objects disappear, right? The object of pain does not disappear. But when we identify with the sensations in the body, the experience is I am suffering.
Mm-hmm.
I am pain. I am suffering. And when we've cultivated a sense of who we are beyond ego, the true self, and we're anchored strongly enough in that, then those same sensations and objects can arise in space. And we go, oh, there's pain. I see that pain. I
Mm-hmm.
recognize that pain. But the perspective of the self sees pain arising and doesn't suffer with pain arising in the field of awareness any more than it suffers because a cloud passes in front of the sun for a moment.
Right. I think we've talked about this in previous podcasts, but how you get to that place where you can create distance from the pain or the sensation, the thought, the feeling, there are two very general ways to do that. One is a more masculine path of becoming more meditative, becoming more still in the mind, and slowly beginning to learn how to distance yourself where you are the subject and the pain and thoughts, feelings are the object. And that can take decades for people to do. It can take a long time or not, doesn't always have to take that long. Another option is through a feminine style, which is to bring your awareness into the sensation and learn how to be with that so that you feel empowered in the sensation, that you know that you can tolerate it. You don't have to be afraid of it. It's just a sensation. It's almost like learning how to surf a wave. Like you can either stand back and study the wave and see that it's just a wave, or you can decide, okay, I'm going to go into the wave and learn how to swim in it or surf in it, and even to some degree enjoy the sensation of the wave.
Yes. And through enough practice and application of those seemingly almost opposite approaches, one would be to cultivate a sense of separation and non-identification with the experiences. The other is to dive into the experience and surrender to it, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
We cultivate those practices enough where we realize that, oh, it's actually the same thing. that actually both of those are happening simultaneously.
Yeah, it's
And
just
then,
which one are you choosing to be with at the moment?
right.
be more attentive to. Yeah.
So I just want to revisit briefly. So what we've just done is lay out using the Buddhist philosophy, which is really it's a physics lesson. It's non-dual teaching about the nature of reality and this pre-understanding, and then what the transcendent understanding is, and then what the sort of space in between is that we have to move through in order to get to a transcendent understanding. And so we've talked about it from that perspective. And that really is the answer to the theological version of the question, which people usually couch like, if God is all powerful, why does God always has a penis in these equations? Why does he allow suffering? And this is going to maybe sound a little blunt, but there's so much wrong with that question that it really can't be answered other than to point to all of the things we just talked about. But that often won't satisfy people who are coming from it from this more sort of religiously themed theological question. Doesn't seem satisfying to them. And the reason that it will never seem satisfying is because the question is flawed. The question is flawed because first, you're making God an object that exists outside of creation. Here we are in creation on earth, and God is some object, some male object, that's now 2 strikes, object gendered, that exists outside of us, that's 3 strikes, right? These are all fundamental misunderstandings from the very beginning that make the question unanswerable. There is not a male omnipotent creature beyond space and time making decisions about space and time and the experiences within it, independent of our own engagement with reality, that is saying essentially, I can do whatever I want and I choose to do this, which is give you the experience of suffering. It's a fundamental misunderstanding about reality, consciousness, and God. And so it just can't be answered. The quote answer to that question, why does God allow suffering, really only comes to resolution through a shift in our understanding of what God is. And so that's probably a different conversation, or all the conversations squished together somehow. But I think it's worth mentioning because that will be the lens through which many people come to this question, or even to this podcast. They go, oh, suffering. I want to know why God allows suffering. I'm going to click on this. To the extent that can be answered, it's really the first part of this talk we just had. It's really the Four Noble Truths. It's specifically 1 and 2, that suffering is integrated into the fabric of the reality of a 3-dimensional world and an ego perspective. And that you can't have the heads side of the coin without having the tails side of the coin.
I think the easier question to ask oneself is, why are you allowing suffering? And then you might actually get somewhere.
Yeah.
Takes the mystery right out of it. Okay, I see this event has happened in my life. I seem to be suffering. What are the beliefs and the perspectives and the way of seeing the world that are creating the suffering, that are making me want to push it away? Or if I feel a lack in my life, what do I think having that thing or person is going to give to me that I'm somehow lacking now?
Yep. Yes. And again, delicately put here, that does apply to even extreme situations of suffering, like the tragic loss of a loved one,
Mm-hmm.
the tragic loss of a life that, and I'm going to put this in quotes, is cut way too short.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll use that extreme example just because it is illustrative. So much of the suffering around that is this cut way too short part of the story of what has transpired.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we talked about at the beginning. So much of suffering is the story. And the ego creates stories about a separate self, a separate person that is supposed to have this very sort of specific arc of being born, meeting somebody, getting married, having kids, working at a job I love, retiring to the beach, dying in bed at 90 years old.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Peacefully.
that's that's this idealized story arc that we have for the separate self.
Mm-hmm.
That's just a story. I mean, it's a nice story. I'm not opposed
Mm-hmm.
to it. I'm also not attached to it. And because I'm not, because I'll just speak for myself, because I'm not attached to it, I'm not going to suffer if that story doesn't play out for me. It's just one of an infinite number of potential stories. So this, again, this isn't to disparage or demean those who are deeply caught in that story and are actively in an experience of acute suffering because that story's been ripped away from them, is really what's happened. um, those people need to be loved and honored and actually supported in the truth of their seemingly separate story, um, until they're in a place where they can work with it in a different way.
Right.
Um, but it does still apply that if you look at even that extreme example, all of the source of suffering comes from the storytelling
Mm-hmm.
about how it's supposed to go, what should happen, and about the story that as you said, that there was this object, this separate other thing that I was attached to and connected to and provided me with something that is now gone, that I'm disconnected from, and that whatever it provided me with is lost with the object.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also not true, but will feel acutely true to people who are suffering. And the answer to their suffering is not to tell them that that's not true.
Right. So another personal example for me was when I decided that I wanted to get divorced, and I went to my ex-husband and said, I need to end this marriage. And then began a long acute period, a long acute period of it's kind of
It's the
paradoxical.
worst kind of suffering.
I mean, it was acute suffering that seemed to last a long time. It was
Yeah.
at least a year of very acute suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And in that process, I had a fantasy in my head of how that decoupling was going to happen and how it was going to go for my kids.
Mm-hmm.
And it went the worst, maybe not the worst imagined way, but it went a way that I would never have expected.
Not the way that your story was telling you it was going to go.
Not the story of who I thought my ex-husband was and what he was capable of.
Mm-hmm.
And he would, I'm sure, and I've heard that he would say the same thing about me,
Sure.
that I did not know that I was married to this person who was capable of this.
Mm-hmm.
And so both of us are suffering our stories, basically,
Yeah.
because we have a story of how someone's going to be, and then under duress, they will be some other way, the way that they have to be for whatever story they're playing out in their heads. It's very similar. Well, let me just continue. And that suffering continued for me, the cognitive dissonance around but I thought I was married to this person, and I'm married to this person or divorcing this person, until I really was able to resolve that he contained or contains, he's not gone, so many different attributes. There are wonderful attributes and there are attributes that I don't prefer. And I could see him clearly. And when I could see him clearly as he is, the suffering stopped. I could see, and I had to accept what I saw too.
Right.
So I had to see and accept that this is how he is. There's a clearing that we do in cellular release therapy with people, where we do all the subconscious causes for having difficulty in a relationship. And there's a healing affirmation that people hear at the end, where you say, is it okay now to feel at peace with this relationship, accepting that this person is as they are, and knowing that you can take care of yourself in whatever way that you want to or need to at all times in this relationship. And so when I got to that place with my ex, knowing that he was as he was, and that contained all characteristics, a spectrum of characteristics, and I also was empowered to take action in my life, to do what I needed to do to take care of myself in the relationship, then there was no more suffering. That suffering ended, and it's not come back.
The suffering ended with the end of the storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
The end of expectations.
Yeah, expectations based on a story about who somebody is that was never really actually true, or
Right.
at best was woefully insufficient and incomplete. Right.
Right. So one of the stories that's happening in people's minds right now, as we are all coping with the loss of so many children, is that people are not capable of violence. That's one of the stories that they shouldn't be capable of violence.
Right.
And that little children shouldn't die at the hands of violence.
Right.
But if we're really looking at the world through eyes wide open, we will see that there is violence against children happening all the time, everywhere. And so part of our relieving the suffering around that is to accept that this is how it is, and take care of yourself in whatever way you need to, and others. So you don't just say, oh, bad things are happening, that's fine, I accept. No, when you have the opportunity, you step in and take care of yourself and others. It's not an abdication of caring.
Right.
It's just seeing clearly that people are capable of a wide variety of acts and behaviors and thought processes. And when you're really a peaceful person inside, you know this and accept this, and you also step into the world powerfully and do things that are right. And I mean that kind of not in a dualistic way, but in the, like, from a soul way, like from the heart, that are right for the heart. You know that because intuitively you just act. Do you want to talk about alchemy?
Sure. So it's another lens of really viewing the nature of suffering. And it's a way of making sense of the presence of suffering. We talked about how to do that from a non-dual perspective, or how the non-dual perspective and teachings and truth help to contextualize suffering and explain it, and thereby, as we follow that to its logical conclusion, alleviate the suffering. Alchemy is another way of understanding that. And so alchemy is kind of generically thought of as this make-believe science of turning lead into gold. And for a long time, that was the actual pursuit of a field called alchemy. Um, but to those who really understood what was going on, um, you know, in the 1400s and beyond, they grasped that their manipulations of real chemicals in the world and this attempt to turn lead into gold was actually a projection of an internal psychic process of trying to purify their own being, to create the gold of, sometimes it's thought of as gold, sometimes it's been referred to as the philosopher's stone, this sort of mythical end product that if you can get all of the chemical reactions right, you create this thing that is essentially a source of eternal health and vitality and youth. Spiritually and psychologically, we would use the same term to describe that is self. Really what alchemy is about what sort of quote chemical reactions need to take place within my being to clear out impurities and refine the essence of what is happening here, such that I can experience this end product called my self, capital S self, which is the I am perspective that is non-egoic, right? Or enlightened. It's enlightenment, essentially. So it's a way of thinking about this process that is analogous to chemistry, basically. And so in this understanding of things, the alchemical understanding, as I was saying, there's a number of chemical reactions that have to take place that ultimately lead to our personal, quote, personal enlightenment, a discovery, a concrete discovery and experience of who we really are, what we really are. And as in modern chemistry, an essential component of what drives that series of reactions that leads to the end product is heat. And the experience of heat is called suffering. So, but again, it's perspective dependent. So it's consistent with what we've already said. But in the alchemy analogy, as we undergo these series of reactions, if we have lost perspective and don't remember that we are actually the alchemist performing the experiment, and that it's a specific experiment designed to achieve a specific end result, if we forget all of that and our perspective shrinks into the equivalent of the ego perspective, then what we're left with is this experience of holy shit, why am I on fire all the time? And then there's a brief reprieve, and then suddenly there's more fire. What is God doing to me? Why is God punishing me? This isn't how it should be. Again, all of the stories that are created about that, the abdication of personal power then projected onto other people or a distant male, omnipotent, punitive God figure. The experience is one of suffering because of the loss of perspective. And when we remember the truth, oh, this is the nature of alchemy, that I have actually prayed for an experience of knowing who I am. I've prayed for an end to suffering. I've prayed to experience the third noble truth, life beyond suffering. And then I didn't know that to get to 3, I have to go through 2, which is, well, I have to go through 1 and 2, which is the experience of life as suffering. So in alchemy, it's, yes, you can have the gold. Here's the specific chemical reactions that need to take place. And the experience of that will seem like suffering, the exposure to that heat. But it's what drives the alchemical process, in the same way that you don't take a bunch of raw ingredients and then throw them into a cold pan and mix it around and then serve it for dinner. At least not if you expect people to eat it or to congratulate you on your skill as a chef, or to enjoy it, right? That what creates the gourmet meal is the exposure to heat and the actual chemical reactions that take place, the the denaturing of the proteins and all those chemical reactions that cook the food and blend the flavors and create all of that change. And it's an analogy, but it's also quite literal. I mean, that really is what's happening in the human experience. There are actual physical changes that take place in our body, in our blood chemistry, etc., that will feel uncomfortable. And you and I have had plenty of these physical experiences. And there's nothing to do about that other than to remember the context and get on board. So since I've been doing this recently, I'll also at this point I'll put up the Temperance card from the Major Arcana of Tarot, because that's the universal symbolism from that tradition that depicts the nature of suffering. And it's all about it's a, quote, tempering process, which means exposure to the tension of opposites. And in the card, it's depicted as hot and cold. And if we just go by that word temperance and use a convenient version of where you see that word used, which is in the tempering of steel, that also is a chemical or alchemical reaction. And so in order to make a really sharp and finely tuned instrument, it involves exposing metal to extreme heat and then pounding on it and then plunging it into cold, and then exposing it to extreme heat again and pounding on it and then plunging it into cold. And if we have forgotten who and what we are, which is all of us until we remember, if we're still in the experience of ignorance, of forgetting, then our perspective on that is the perspective of the sword, which feels like being heated up and being pounded on and being plunged into cold. I mean, it feels like agony. It's suffering. That experience changes when we recognize, oh, I'm not just some hunk of metal randomly being abused by forces of nature outside of my control, that I am in fact an active participant in a process designed to create a very sharp and useful tool, and that this is in fact what I asked for, and that I am not just the metal, but I'm also the blacksmith. And the blacksmith would be the perspective of self, and the sword would be perspective of ego. So maybe that's helpful to people to have, a less sort of spiritual or religious or non-dual. This is a more kind of colorful metaphor, this example of alchemy. But again, it points to the same truth, which is that all suffering originates in a loss of perspective of truth. All suffering originates in ignorance and the perspective of the ego. And so ultimately, that third noble truth, suffering can be overcome, or we can move beyond suffering, is synonymous with saying we can move beyond ego. It's the same thing. The end of suffering comes with the revelation of self.
And the Noble Eightfold Path is what the Buddhists say is the what you follow to get to three, get to the suffering ends, and you are now in nirvana. And summarizing that, that comes through meditation and concentration, wisdom and insight, and good conduct. That's like the, synopsis. I wanted to offer something else from the Hindu tradition.
Right.
So, spiritual practitioners in Hinduism, they do puja and they do tapas. Puja is devotional practices, usually loving practices where they will take a murti, which is a figure of whatever goddess or god that they're devoted to, and they treat that figure as if it's real. So they feed it, they wash it, they dress it, they put it to bed, like they do the whole thing. So there's this pathway of love that they follow. But there's also tapas, which means spiritual heat. And so there are practices that they do that literally are done through desire, through heat, that are really create a lot of suffering. Things like fasting, that can create a lot of suffering for people, and usually does until you get used to it and see it for what it is. Going out into extreme temperatures and exposing the body to very, very hot environments or very, very cold environments. One of the first things a lot of Hindu practitioners, yogi practitioners do in India is they go and sit in the funeral grounds and they watch the bodies being burnt and brought. And so there's a lot of suffering that arises as they come to terms with the shortness of a human life. So even in the word, the alchemical word tapas, there's that fire that you have to cultivate to move beyond the egoic perspective of the world.
Yeah. So again, it's just a perfect expression of how these are different lenses that are really all the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the Hindu tradition obviously understands that. And so the alchemy is, no pun intended, baked into the Hindu tradition.
Mm-hmm.
But there's another really essential component that of that practice, though, which is consciously choosing your suffering.
Mm-hmm.
It's an embracing of that first noble truth: life is suffering, but it's not a powerlessness. It's, oh, okay, life is suffering. Okay, how can I participate in this? And in the Hindu tradition, there are ways to say, oh, I can participate in this by understanding that life is suffering,
Mm-hmm.
that suffering is actually an alchemical process designed to bring about changes within me that lead to my own enlightenment,
Yeah.
and that I can get on board with that. And I don't have to suffer passively and allow the alchemy to be simply thrust upon me. I can find ways to be an active participant in that. Now, like all of these, that can then immediately be misunderstood or distorted and become a hyper religious practice of self-flagellation.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And so there's a very thin line there between life is suffering and I can be an active participant in the alchemy of that, into suffering is good.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to consciously seek out suffering.
Make it a virtue.
And make it a virtue. And I think the Catholic Church has been particularly bad with this, both in its kind of earlier actual teachings and then in misapplication of teachings or poor communication and understanding and correction of the previously misunderstood teachings. And so having grown up Catholic, there's just an obsession with suffering. in that religion, an absolute obsession with it. And it shows up in all kinds of different ways, but very commonly it's seen as it's often insidious and unconscious, but there's this sense of suffering is good. And if I'm suffering, it's just proof of how much God believes in me and my ability to suffer and to deal with this. It's a real distortion of the truth of the suffering and the nature of suffering and the alchemical reality of suffering. And it becomes, like you said, it becomes a virtue in and of itself, which is not what we're going for here at all. That would reject the third noble truth, that suffering can be transcended.
Right? Which is also baked into the myths of Christianity. So what happens is Jesus is the most holy person in that tradition, and he suffered, and I would like to be like Jesus, so suffering is good.
Right.
Except Jesus didn't, he had an additional part of the story.
Right. Right. Catholics,
he moved on from that.
Yeah, they like to really fixate on the crucifixion, as if, I mean, then there's of course the resurrection, but man, there's a lot of fixation on the crucifixion and the suffering. But the resurrection is the transcendence of suffering, and is in fact brought about by the suffering, right? And without diving too deep into theology here and making this about a particular religion, the problem there is that in the story, Jesus transcends suffering and resurrects in a new form. And what's missed there in 99.9% of the Catholic teaching is that we don't have to physically die to have that experience. That Jesus physically died to model that alchemical process for us and show what's possible, but that we can live that experience symbolically, metaphorically, which isn't different than reality, but it doesn't require us to physically die and be put in a grave and then resurrect to the surprise of our friends and family. It does not require that. Again, I'll reference, we just did an episode on death. That there are 1,000 ways to die, and if you are coming at this from a Catholic or Christian perspective, don't take my word for it. Take the word of St. Paul, who said, I die daily. And understand what he meant by that. There's 1,000 ways to die daily, to embrace the alchemical process and the transformation that takes place with that, and to actually resurrect into our true self in this physical vessel. So yes, it's in all of the great religious traditions. It's just usually really distorted and misunderstood and misapplied.
Okay. So we've made a list of some beliefs that people hold that increase our suffering, that whoever's watching this, listening to this, can maybe think about, do I hold that belief? Do I want to continue holding that belief? Is this creating unnecessary, a virtuous suffering that I don't actually have to perceive? So one of the difficulties people have with being human is we want to avoid pain, physical pain. We want to avoid aging. We want to avoid illness, and we want to avoid death because of many other subsidiary beliefs of timing and the right way to die and the right way to age and all of that. But the reality is that this physical body will age. It will eventually crumble into dust, and we get sick. And as part of that belief system that that shouldn't be happening, there's a lot of clinging that people have, attachment that people have to Miracle cures, spiritual bypassing about energy and the ability to magically not get sick. Like if I just pray hard enough, nobody in my family will get sick. We'll all just get through COVID without getting it. That my vibration is high enough that I won't ever get cancer. These kinds of beliefs that are just kind of part of this erroneous and avoidant viewpoint of being in a physical body.
Yes. So shrunk down, the belief is I am my body.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's the ego perspective of ignorance that will inevitably lead to suffering.
Another thing is that bad things that happen to us are punishments from something outside of us.
Right.
You fill in the blank about what you think it is. The universe, God, other people.
Right.
And that good things we earned. We somehow earned by praying hard enough, by being good enough, etc.
So that's the perspective of the sword, right? Forgetting about the actual process that's unfolding and going, there's this big strong guy that's just beating the shit out of me constantly. Right? And I did nothing to deserve this.
Right.
Or I must have done something to deserve this. Both are equally incorrect. And both based on a story that isn't true.
Right. And so the way through that is to understand that life includes experiences we tend to like and experiences that we don't like and everything in between.
Right. And that all of that can and is working for us and does not need to necessitate suffering or be equivalent to suffering when our orientation towards it is more whole.
Mm-hmm. Another belief system that people have is kind of paradoxical. People either think relationships suck and relationships should be easy.
Mm-hmm.
So that creates a ton of suffering. The reality is, as I've experienced it, is that when people are in their ego, there's a lot of factors, maybe incalculable factors, that make relationship dynamics complex when a person is identified with the ego or the body. Relationships become a lot more easy when you relax and can accept that people are different from one another, infinitely different, perhaps, and that's okay. That the differences are okay. And there's a desire to understand or connect with the differences and accept them.
Yeah, I would just add another twist on that. An expectation of relationship being part of the correct story of life and something we quote should have or deserve to have, or it's supposed to be there. We see a lot of this, like I'm supposed to have my soulmate. And if I don't find the magical other, my life is somehow less than or incomplete. If that's the story, then that's going to lead to suffering. And I know this will come up because I've had clients bring it up to me. We might seem to be hypocrites with that because we have each other. But
Right.
people don't understand our perspectives and the non-attachment to one another that is also present, which is part of what makes our relationship so joyful and easy, is that there's no expectation really of one another or of the relationship itself to provide something within us that otherwise is perceived to be lacking or not present. Right.
Right.
So, so it
I
might,
also don't have these magical stories about you anymore.
right.
I don't,
Oh
I
man.
know. Oh. Well, I used to have a
No,
lot
no.
of,
The real reaction is thank God.
right?
Yeah.
I used to have a lot of fantastical stories about you,
Yeah.
and of course wanted you to get on board with them. Things like the story of being a twin flame.
Mm,
Like, if, I know that is a story of suffering.
yeah.
So if anyone is not aware of what that means,
Don't look
twin,
it up. Don't
well,
do
I'll
it.
just give you the general idea. Twin flames are supposed to be special soulmates that are really just one soul, but the two
It's been
halves
tragically separated.
right. The two halves have been separated, and their journey is to come back together again and ultimately do some kind of magical spiritual work in the world. And the relationship is supposed to be very tumultuous and extremely painful, and lots of reflecting things to one another. And I used that story when I was, I almost said when I was younger. I mean, truthfully, I was younger,
Yes.
emotionally younger, physically
Yeah.
younger, and in all ways much younger. Because I had not experienced the kind of relationship that you and I have had before. And I needed a fancy story to explain how intense the emotions were in the relationship. And so I chose that story.
Hmm.
But God, what a horrible story. Now I can see it's a terrible story.
Yeah.
And it's one that so many people are caught up in
Yeah.
because to them, it explains, like, part of the lore of twin flames is that if your twin's not ready, you won't have unity in this lifetime, and you'll have to wait who God knows how many more lifetimes to have unification with your twin.
Yeah.
God, what a sad story. Like, it's so
Yeah.
tragic.
It is. Yeah. It's just spiritualized Romeo and Juliet. I mean,
It is.
it's just,
I never thought of it that way, but it is.
it's just dressed up spiritual Shakespeare.
Yeah.
It's just,
Star-crossed lovers.
it's
Yeah.
just fancy storytelling. Um,
Yeah.
and to the extent that it's true in the same way that Shakespeare is true or Star Wars is true. It's archetypally true. It's
Mm-hmm.
not literally true.
Right.
So yes.
So I had to kill off a lot of these fancy stories that I had about our relationship,
Yeah.
to the point where I think at some point I may have even said to you something like, if we were done tomorrow, that would be okay. I would
Hmm.
want you to I would want to release you
Yeah.
to the next adventure in your life. I'm not holding you in this relationship. I couldn't anyway. That's a story.
Right.
People think they can
Right.
uh, hold tight to someone and lock them down with kids or marriage.
Right.
You can never do that. People
You're not
leave
the
when they
boss of
need
me.
to.
You
Well,
can't tell me what to do.
it's not realistic.
No, it's not. And yes, it's a dramatic relationship version of storytelling, ignorance, etc. That if we're caught up in it, you're going to suffer because
Mhm.
your partner can't live up to that. And that's
Right.
part of what that twin flame story does is it gives people context for their suffering. It's not accurate, and it
Mm-mm.
also will keep you trapped in the suffering
Right.
because you're making your happiness dependent on some seemingly separate other. Again, it's an attachment to an object will always create suffering.
Yeah. So I think the advice that I have recently been offering, or the support I've been recently offering people who are like, where is my person? I want my person,
Hmm.
is to help support people in understanding that there is no one person that fulfills all your needs, that can realistically meet all of your desires and needs. That there's literally no one on the earth I don't know who that person would be for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
It's
not
not me.
you.
I
Sorry,
don't want
love.
that job.
You don't want that job.
Yeah.
It's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
But the reality is that if you look around your life, you will see that your life is, hopefully, if you've maintained connection at any level at all, filled with people that may want to give you these various aspects of what you need.
Mhm.
And if we think more broadly and are less focused on this one person giving us exactly what we need, we can just take the pressure off everyone.
Yeah. Yep.
So that I think we had written on here as the suffering due to isolation and excessive individualization, or thinking that you have to do everything on your own, or that this one other person has to be everything for you, like being too narrowly focused. Let's see. Seeing life as hard or painful is a huge suffering thing.
Yes.
Can I tell a little story about you? I'll tell a little story about
Well,
you.
here we go. Yes, my love, you have permission.
Okay. Well, it's a story that's a tale as old as time. Song, whatever that line
So it is
goes.
both personal in my experience, but also impersonal in that it is an archetypal
It's a
story.
shared experience.
And for the record, I have no idea what story you're about to tell.
It's very minor. We've talked about it recently. So there have been times that I have observed you getting upset at inanimate objects.
No,
Because they don't function
they won't
when
behave
you want them
properly.
to. They don't behave how they're supposed to.
Yes.
They don't respond quickly enough. And then, suffering ensues.
Mostly for the object.
The
Die,
object
die, printer,
gets
die.
gets Hulk smashed. So, I observed this happen a number of times, and many clients that I've worked with have said, I smashed the wall today because X, Y, and Z, or I'm so pissed off that this thing in my life isn't working. And what I feel that comes from is this idea that life should be easy, that everything should just unfold
Mhm.
simply, without any road bumps, without any resistance, that everything is effortless and needs to be effortless. And if it's not, then something really wrong has happened in the universe, or the universe is attacking you in some way.
Mhm.
All of that. Life is not always easy, and nor is it always hard. All of that is dependent on our perspective of the moment.
Yep.
And when we stop acting like this is unfair, what's happening is unfair, we can relieve a lot of our own suffering.
Yeah. So to connect that to the earlier conversation, the expectation that life should be easy is a rejection of the first of the noble truths.
Mhm.
No, life is suffering. Except paradoxically, an over attachment to, well, life is hard. When we wear that like a cape, that's our uniform. Life is hard. Well, now we've come into the celebration of suffering.
Mhm.
Right? We've gone beyond simply accepting suffering as an experience of restricted perspective in duality to wearing it as a badge of honor,
Mhm.
even if we say we don't like it and don't want it and so forth. Really what's happening there is we're wearing it like a badge of honor, and it's a way of coping with that first noble truth: life is suffering.
Mhm.
But coping with that truth is not the same thing as understanding it and engaging with it. It's just a compensatory strategy that says, okay, well, if I simply expect suffering all the time, then I won't be surprised by it and
Yeah.
I can build up this kind of superhuman tolerance to suffering, which again is not the point. The point is to understand suffering as a part of reality, as a part of duality, so that we can move beyond it.
Mm.
Not to just say this is all there is to life. So if I can paraphrase the Buddha, if I may be so bold, or make a minor addendum, the first noble truth is life is suffering. The asterisk is life is not just suffering.
Mm. Right.
There is more to life in duality than just suffering.
Right. So how did you navigate understanding that sometimes shit doesn't work?
Well, for me, I actually distinctly remember where the shift took place. Many years ago, I was having another one of those experiences. I don't remember what it was about in particular, but the revelation in the moment was, um, I have just handed all my power to some mysterious external force that is working against me, as if there is something other than self
Mm.
in creation, which I knew better in many ways, and I knew better
Yeah.
intellectually, and in many ways I knew better experientially, and had an embodied knowing of that. And in many ways, my willingness to let these things come up allowed that to be the final piece that sort of slotted into place for me, where I went, I just projected out a huge chunk of myself.
Mm.
And when I recognized that, then I cultivated a practice of paying attention to when that sort of frustration would arise,
Mhm.
and not rejecting the sensations and the frustration, but also not creating a story. And so it's the practice that we talked about at the beginning, or
Mhm.
that you talked about. Simultaneously, I would engage in the feminine practice of surrendering to the experience of suffering,
Mhm.
while also holding the masculine contextual frame of reference for what was going on. So I was allowing myself to be the sword and experience that whole alchemical process, while
Mhm.
also simultaneously being the blacksmith, and remembering that I was in charge of this whole process, and that what
Mhm.
was really happening was part of a series of alchemical events that are refining or tempering my consciousness.
Mhm.
And so then it's just get on board with that, let it be what it is, hold that practice, and eventually the third noble truth, the suffering ceases.
Right.
That doesn't mean I don't still have experience of frustration, but I don't
Mhm.
identify with them. To me,
Right.
having an experience of frustration is the same thing as um, walking outside on a beautiful sunny day and a cloud passes in front of the sun. And I go, oh, well, okay. Well, I was enjoying the sun, but oh well. And then I just keep walking.
Yes. So for a person not in your perspective, which is a pretty big perspective, right? If you're a person who is having the experience of, I can't get my phone to work, I can't get this website to work, I
Stop being
can't
a
get,
victim.
well, stop being a victim.
That's my
Well,
advice.
well, yes, yes, but the attitude that has to shift so you can not be a victim is recognizing that you have an idea that things should go a certain way, that you should be getting your way,
Mhm.
and that it should be all on your timing.
And that life is the experience of life in creation and duality should be or is harmonious
Mhm.
and peaceful. Stop making the world something it isn't.
Right. We
The
don't
world,
always get what we want when we want it.
not in the world.
Right.
No.
And that's cultivating something called patience.
It is patience,
Mhm.
perspective. Again, it's not expecting something of the world that it is not capable of providing.
Right.
and let's go back to Christian tradition. The Christian mystical tradition is, all of this is folded into that. Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is within.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty big teaching. Jesus said, stop looking for peace in the world. That's not where it lives.
Mm.
You will not find it there. The world is never going to bend to all of your whims and provide you with a seamlessly harmonious experience. It's not what it's designed to do. It's impossible.
Yep.
Until, paradoxically,
Mm-hmm.
you're anchored in that within. And then when you have entered the kingdom of heaven within, then everywhere you go in the world, you bring the kingdom of heaven with you.
Mm-hmm.
So then paradoxically, your experience of, quote, the world is always one of peace.
Mm-hmm.
Not because it's originating in the world. The world is still not the origin and the source of that peace and tranquility. That's just within you. But everywhere you go with your inner kingdom of heaven, there you are.
Mm-hmm.
and then you're sharing that with the whole world. And ultimately, the nth degree iteration of this is everyone being anchored in the kingdom of heaven within, walking around in the world together. And still the world is not the source of peace and contentment. But if everybody is anchored in peace and contentment, what the hell is the difference?
Right.
There's no functional difference.
Mm-hmm.
But that got very lofty very quick. Let's come back to breaking our phones and printers. When we're having those experiences, the way of working with that is to recognize what you're doing. You have just forgotten the truth of the world. You're expecting the world to be something that it isn't. You've forgotten who and what you are. And that doesn't mean you reject the feelings, but it means you can have the feelings and maintain the perspective of truth, of self at the same time, which is that life is suffering. Sometimes shit happens. I can be upset about that. I can be cranky about that. I can not like it, but I can do all of that without pretending it should be some other way.
Yeah.
And it's the pretending that it should be some other way that's the actual source of suffering.
Great.
So I can get mad now when I've lost to one of the Elden Ring bosses like 27 times in a row, and I'm actually not suffering.
Right.
I'm going, come on, and I'm throwing out all kinds of stuff, and I'm going. In my inner experience of this is awesome. I love this. The existence of opposites. That's the Temperance card again. It's opposites coexisting.
Right. And that's another illustration of the pre-trans. Like, I'm great at picking up on energy. I don't perceive you to be suffering at all when you're playing Elden Ring. I know you well enough now that if you were suffering, you'd stop playing.
Right.
But to an outside observer, that would look like you're suffering a lot.
That's right.
So you can never really know exactly where someone is in their experience unless you are attuned to their inner reality.
Right. Or unless and until you have a direct experience of knowing that we are not our emotions. And so I can experience emotions in the same way that I can experience weather. And sort of given my choice on any given day, 99% of the time, I would flip the switch that says sunshine, cool breeze,
50 degrees.
And I'm going, this is amazing. Right. But it can also be like snowing like crazy or cloudy and rainy. And I go, ooh, that's kind of nice. I like that.
Contrast.
And I can experience all of that without identifying with any of it.
Right.
It's the exact same thing with our emotions. And when we've cultivated that, then suffering ends.
I think that feels very complete for me.
It does. If I were to continue, I would begin to perceive suffering due to the lack of a nap. So we will end there. And wish everyone a life free from suffering while knowing that there is really no such thing until you know who you are.
Mm.
And remembering that helps us move through the suffering process. So, okay. See
Till
everybody
next
soon.
time.
Bye-bye.